Hungarian Folk Tales. Tiny Tom and the Lily Princess. Once upon a time, far, far away, over the ocean and beyond, there lived a king, and with the king lived a queen. And they had a very tiny son. No matter how many doctors they took him to, he just wouldn't grow. Tiny he was, and tiny he remained. The king grieved much over this, the queen even more. So much so that she fell ill. On her deathbed she lay and called for the king. She said to him, "All I ask of you is that when you bury me, have a lily planted on my grave and have it guarded day and night so that no one can steal it." She spoke, and straight away she died. The king was much in grief. "If only my son were big, who can I leave my kingdom to when I am dead?" He buried his queen in pomp, wept over her, and mourned her. And he sent a proclamation across the kingdom calling for everyone who had a lily to bring it to the court so that one could be chosen for the queen's grave. They brought lilies by the cartload, but they couldn't agree which one was the finest of all. The king could hear all this uproar and went down into the courtyard. "What's all this quarrelling about?" One of the gardeners replied. "There are so many lilies here that we can hardly move, but we can't decide which one is the finest of all." "Where are you, Tiny Tom, my son? Come here and do something useful for a change. Close your eyes and pick a lily." So Tiny Tom closed his eyes and groped around like a blind man. And do you know what? The lily he picked was beautiful, and every bloom on it sparkled like a diamond. The king asked, "Who brought us this lily?" "Your Majesty, I brought it from Fairy Helen's garden." "Well then, you plant it and keep guard over it so that no one can steal it." "If you please, Your Majesty, may I ask that you send Tiny Tom with me? So if I should doze off, he'll be awake and alert." "Very well then," said the king. And so it happened. The old woman planted the flower and guarded it as if it were her life itself. So there they were, keeping guard until the old woman said, "Tiny Tom, I'm going to lie down for a while and I'll drop off to sleep. You stay guard over the lily so that no one can take it." "No one can take it? You sleep well, old lady." And while Tiny Tom was keeping guard, out of nowhere appeared a little man. "Good evening, Tom. Do you know what kind of flower you're guarding here?" "Well, I know that it's a lily and it comes from Fairy Helen's garden." "You see, that lily is the princess from Dwarfland. Let me tell you. Helen once went to see the king in Dwarfland and took a great liking to the princess. So she begged the king to let her have his daughter for a week or two, and he did. Helen was envious of her beauty, and she treated the princess so badly that she wept and wept, and then she died. When she was buried, that lily grew out of her grave, and it spoke once. "Take me to the grave where a mother cried as much as I did over her dwarf of a son." And when the old nurse heard this, she pulled up the lily and brought it here. But Fairy Helen's own nurse heard all of this and told Fairy Helen. Now Helen can never be at peace until the flower is stolen back from here. "Come here and I'll see to your troubles." And at that the little dwarf of a man pulled his beard from between his legs and he disappeared as if he had never been there. Tom was thinking and tried to stay awake. Suddenly he heard a fluttering and rustling. 12 fairies appeared. They made a circle around Tom, dancing, thinking that they could make him dizzy and one of them could steal the lily from the grave. But Tom was sharp. he shook the old woman awake and said, "Get up, old lady, they've come for the lily." So the old woman jumped up and took out her old spindle, and then, swish, swish, she went at them. "Be off with you from here," she said, and she beat and slapped the fairies until they flew off back to fairyland without the lily. There they told Fairy Helen that they had failed to bring the lily with them. Now she had a 7-legged horse, and she mounted it, and off she went. Now as Tiny Tom was keeping guard, he suddenly heard a voice. "Tom, I think they're going to take me away. Fairy Helen is coming." And out of the lily there came a tiny young woman, more beautiful and radiant than the golden sun itself. Tom, if only I had my butterfly carriage for us to fly away in." And at the very moment she said that, 6 butterflies came flying there, drawing a fine carriage. The dwarf princess asked, "Will you come with me, Tom?" "Of course I will. Never will I part from you." Up they went, up and up, into the bright blue sky. The princess turned and said, "Tom, look back and tell me what you see." "Oh, it's Fairy Helen. Don't let her catch up with us." Up and up they flew as fast could be. Suddenly, a huge sheet of flame came licking at Tom's back. "Tom, look back and tell me what you see now." "Oh, it's Fairy Helen. Her horse's breath is aflame and I can feel its heat. Just let us get up between the sun and the stars and the moon, for up there she has no powers." Now when they reached Dwarfland, the joy was great indeed. So pleased was the king to see his long-lost daughter that he swept her into his arms and covered her in kisses. He did the same with Tom. He said straight away that he would give his daughter's hand to Tom and make him king of the land. Then came the great wedding feast. There was no end to the dwarfs there, each one more handsome than the next, and everybody lived happily ever after. Hungarian Folk Tales. The Fairy from the Oak Tree. Once upon a time, many years ago, there lived the son of the Green King. Now, since he was all alone in the palace, he was bored, and so he picked up his gun and set off hunting. When he came into the forest, he spied a little rabbit, took aim, and was about to shoot. "Excuse me, young prince, one good deed deserves another. Spare me my life." And so he spared the rabbit's life and went further into the forest while the rabbit scampered away. Then he came upon a fox, and the fox said to him, "Don't shoot, young prince. Spare me, and your good deed will deserve another." So the prince spared his life too and went further into the forest. There he found a deer, and the deer also spoke to him, "Spare me my life and good fortune will bless you." Off you go to the centre of the forest. There you will find an oak tree with 3 branches. Lop off one of the branches and out will come a fairy. But take some water with you, for she will probably have need of that. So off he went, and he came upon the oak tree, and he lopped off a branch, and a beautiful fairy appeared. "Water, water, please. I need water." The young prince dashed to help, but dropped his flask and all the water spilled out. The poor fairy died there and then. All he could do was to take her in his arms and carry her home and bury her. Time passed and the prince set off hunting again, and he came upon the fox. "Now then, kind young prince, for your good deed I'll tell you something good. Go into the forest, cut off another branch of that oak, but bring water with you because you may have need of it." The prince had a flask of wine with him, and he thought that the wine would do. He lopped off the branch. Out came the beautiful fairy. He gave her some wine, but still she went and died. So he picked her up and carried her home in great sorrow and buried her. After mourning her for a while, he once again set off into the forest to go hunting, and he came upon the little rabbit. "Now then, kind young prince, for your good deed I'll tell you something good, but come with me and I'll show you a spring of running water." Then they came upon the oak. "Now lop off that branch." And once again a beautiful fairy came out of the branch and cried, "Water, water, I need water." The little rabbit took the beaker, gave it to the fairy, who drank deep from it, and this time did not die. She then knelt before the young prince and thanked him for freeing her from the oak tree. They embraced and kissed. So now all three of them set off home. On their way to the palace, they came to a well and sat down beside it. There the fairy spoke. "I dare not go into your palace wearing fairy clothes. Please go home and fetch me some new robes." Now there was a willow there, and she climbed up into it, and a witch arrived to draw water. She glanced into the well and saw a beautiful fairy. She gazed and gazed but couldn't see anyone in the water. Finally she saw the fairy up in the tree. She called out to her and asked her what she was doing up in the tree. The fairy explained everything to the witch. And what did the witch do but seize hold of the fairy and throw her into the well, and the fairy changed into a beautiful golden fish. Then the witch set off home and fetched her own daughter to the well and made her climb up into the tree. Soon the prince came back carrying clothes. He saw the little rabbit and asked him where the girl was. "I went home to have a bite and a sup, and when I came back, she was up in the tree." So the prince looked around and, right enough, there was a girl in the tree. "Down you come and put these clothes on." And when she came down from the tree, he saw her face, and it was ugly now, when before it had been so beautiful. "Oh, dear prince, I was struck by the rays of the sun, and they changed my face." So the young prince went ahead and gave her the clothes to change into, because he thought she was the fairy. And he took her back home to the palace. One day the witch came to see her daughter, and when she was there she said, "I went by the well, and there I saw in the water a fine golden fish. Now what you have to do is pretend to be ill and tell the prince that the only thing that will cure you is if you have the golden fish caught." The prince would do anything for his princess. So the golden fish was caught and cooked, and she ate some and was cured. A single scale fell from the fish to the ground, and out of it there grew a beautiful golden apple tree, which burst into flower every evening and grew apples by noon the next day, which the fairies came for in the evening. Once again the witch went to see her daughter. "What's going on here? You'll have to have that tree cut down, or else they'll know that you're not the fairy." So the young queen said to the king, "We have no use of that apple tree. Cut it down so that we won't ever see it again." Now nearby lived a poor man, and he was the one who cut the tree down. And when he was chopping it up into logs, a small chip flew off, and he put it in his pocket and took it home with him. The following day, the man, his wife and daughter went off to work for the king. They set off so early that they had no time to sweep the floors or make their beds. But in the evening, when they got home, they found that the house had been swept clean and all the beds were made. And they wondered who could have come to their house. On the next morning, they set off to work again. But they left behind their daughter, who hid herself. What did she see but the fairy pop out of the chip of wood and start sweeping the house? Then the daughter took tight hold of the chip of wood to stop the fairy returning to it. So that was how they caught the fairy. And the two girls went off to work at the king's court. There they took turns in telling stories. The king asked, "Now tell us another one about what you saw and did in your life." Once upon a time, there was a young prince, and one day he went hunting and he met a little rabbit, a fox, and a deer. For I am the fairy who the young prince set free from the oak tree. And the prince embraced his fairy tenderly. He had the witch and her daughter tied to a horse's tail, and the prince and the fairy from the oak tree lived happily ever after. Hungarian Folk Tales. Wooden Peter. Once there lived a farmer and his wife. Now these good people didn't have any children, and so one day the farmer said to his wife, "I'm going off into the forest to carve us a child out of wood." Now his wife laughed at this, but the farmer bundled up his stuff and set off into the forest. There he met some wood carvers. "God blessings on you this day. I came to get a small piece of wood." So they chopped him a piece of wood and he started to carve himself a child. It was evening when he returned home, and his wife laughed when she saw he'd brought home a wooden child. They had their supper, and there was a little left over. "Now that's just enough for our son." Off they went to bed, and around midnight the boy called out, "Well, mother dear, are you sound asleep?" At that moment they woke up, and great was their surprise to see the wooden boy had come to life. They admired the boy until the break of day, and then the priest baptized him and named him Wooden Peter. When he came to be 3 days old, he asked if he could go out and find himself a friend to play with. "Hey, do you know if there's someone who makes swords in this town?" "Of course there is." So the boy went back into the house. "Father, please could you give me 8 florins? You can have whatever you need." "All I need is 8 florins." And off he went to the sword maker. "Good day to you, good sword maker. Let me have for 8 florins the sword that you first made. That's the one for me." So the sword maker went to the swords and sorted until he found an old rusty sword and a sheath to go with it. Peter took the sword, strapped it on, and it looked like the sword had been made especially for him. "Now, here's your 8 florins, for even your first sword has to be paid for." Next day there was a huge mob of people in the town. As they were moving towards the fair, they heard that there were 2 oxen tethered together with a golden chain. Whoever could cut the chain in 2 could take the oxen as his own. So Wooden Peter stepped up to say, "If you'll permit me, I'll cut the chain." So then Peter set to, and he cut that golden chain with a swish and a swoosh that could be heard across the country, far and near. Up went the tails of the 2 oxen, and they didn't stop trotting until they reached the stable. The owner of the oxen said, "Well, Wooden Peter, off with you home to feed the oxen, but you should know that all they eat is glowing embers." Peter set fire to 12 bundles of wood. When they were aflame, he took the water pail and filled it with glowing embers. The 2 oxen ate them all up, and one of them went off to where the sun rises, one to where the sun sets. So Peter said, "Now, Father, let me show you something." He tapped the corner of the gate with his fingers in 2 places, and from one of them good wine gushed out, and from the other good brandy. Now, Father, everyone can drink to their heart's content. Do you see that wheelbarrow? I do indeed, son. And that millstone? Yes, I see it. Now, when the barrow stands in front of the door and the millstone jumps into it of its own accord, the wine will turn to water and the brandy to deep red blood, and then you'll know that I am dead. And then, if you want to find me, sit into that wheelbarrow and I'll take you to where I am. Now, I have to go off to see the world and try my fortune. After that, Wooden Peter set off across 7 lands and 7 seas until he came to a town in which there lived a king. Good day to you, your good majesty. Welcome you are. And what sort of journey are you on? I set off to be of service, to try my fortune. And how much would you require for a year? Nothing at all, only what I eat and what I drink. So Peter stayed in the town, working as a carpenter. He was so clever with his hands that the old king took a liking to him. Now the king had a daughter who fell so in love with Wooden Peter that she thought she would die if she wasn't allowed to marry him. Well then, said the king, I won't have you dying on me, so I'll let you give him your hand and be his wife. I'll announce a great wedding feast and you'll live as husband and wife. One day the king received a letter telling him to gather together everyone in the land to go off to fight in the war. When the king saw this, he began to weep. Now, good Father Majesty, do not weep, for I'll go alone to the war. My son, what can you do alone? You'll be like a gnat against a bison. But Wooden Peter went off, and he was wielding his sword so fiercely that he beat them one and all. But then he stumbled, and that's how they defeated him. As quickly as they could, they buried him in the ground. In the morning, as the light was dawning, the barrow went to the door. The millstone jumped into it of its own accord, the wine turned to water, and the brandy to deep red blood. So the farmer got into the barrow and went to where Peter had been cut down. He searched for him high and low, but to no avail. Then he saw the 2 oxen coming. The 2 oxen began to turn the soil with their horns until they uncovered Peter, but there was no sign of life in him. And so one ox put him back together again, and the other put his soul back into him. And Wooden Peter awoke. I slept so well. You'd have slept forever if it hadn't been for us, said the oxen. They went home, and the king called the whole court together and crowned Wooden Peter king. And he and his queen lived happily ever after.